Chapter 3. The long corridor was tinted red and teeming with alien life, the giant bugs tearing towards them lightning fast, and Jess shouted to be heard, his heart in his throat, hearing nothing but alien screams. Something had gone wrong with their transmitters. "Lara! Pop! We're losing you!" They were down a dozen now, torn to dusky pieces as the three men fired and kept firing. Shrieking drones leapt over their fallen siblings, a relentless charge into the team's curtain of explosive fire. The Candyman yelled, the words rising clear and strong over the screeching attack. "Line's dead! Can't hear you on the set!" It was a bad place to be, and it could only get worse. A bug scrambled towards him, clawing through the growing pile of dead or dying drones, limbs and bodies melting through the deck in oozing acid splash. Jess fired. The rifle pushed to full auto, hot and jumping, and the monster's head was suddenly gone. Even as it collapsed, he could see others behind it, closing the distance and oblivious to their own mortality. Jess shouted again into the static of his mic, hoping against hope, and there was nothing. They were cut off. Part of the deck had melted through, and several of the maimed bodies dropped out of sight, disappearing through the growing, smoking hole. And still they advanced, barely slowed by the awesome hail of armor-piercing rounds. He made the only decision he could, praying that Teep and Pulaski could hear him over the intensifying attack. "Fall back! Too many! Fall back! Sound off!" Jess fired again, shuffling back a half step, risking a glance at the boys, and felt his gut plummet, felt his mind teeter on the brink of something vast and terrible. Both men were firing, holding the line, except Pulaski's abdomen was shredded, slippery coils of intestine hanging down to his knees in purple ropes. He was grinning the wide grin that spoke of his love for the fight, but his teeth were outlined in red, blood dripping from the corners of his mouth. Past him was Teep. Jess knew it, even though he couldn't see his face. Teep wore the flat crab body of a hatchling, its long tail wrapped tightly around his throat, its spidery muscular legs curving around the back of his skull. Somehow Teep could still see his targets, picking them out from the seemingly endless river of teeth and claws. And Jess had stopped firing, but the drones weren't reaching him, running and screaming, but not getting close enough to take him down. "Fucking hell of a last ride, Jess!" Candyman screamed, bloody mist spraying from his red teeth. And Teep couldn't speak, only turned his head in Jess's direction, the noose of the facehugger's smooth, scaled tail slipping tightly around his throat. Pulaski looked at Jess, blasting the oncoming wave without targeting, his eyes filmed, cataract white. "You better get out of here, Jesse," he said, his voice suddenly a dull, dead monotone, but louder than anything else. "We're dead already." Jess opened his mouth to resist, to tell him that he would stay, that he wouldn't leave them. And nothing at all came out, no matter how hard he struggled. He drew in lungfuls of air, determined to scream, to be heard over the dying howls of the drones and the rattle of pulse fire, above the stench of blood and burning. And woke up. For a moment Jess didn't move, staring at the empty net overhead, afraid to close his eyes again. Slowly his heart stopped pounding, and the light sheen of sweat that the nightmare had left on his brow turned cold. Still, he didn't move, not wanting to. There was nowhere to go anyway. The intense feelings of guilt and horror he'd felt in his dream faded, leaving him both wrung out and strangely thoughtful. He closed his eyes again, thinking about the dream, about the conflicted feelings he'd had since they escaped the station. Horror, sorrow, guilt, and some dark and heavy feeling that he hadn't examined too carefully. The horror and sadness were obvious. The rest of it, he thought, might be worth a try and work through. He wouldn't have much longer to make his peace. Teep and Pulaski, dead. He wasn't suffering survivor's guilt, or at least he didn't think so. He made it because that was how things had worked out, right or wrong, and considering where he and Lara and the kid had ended up, making it and survivor didn't really seem to apply. He wasn't bothered overmuch about checking out, although not because he felt he deserved it. The simple truth was, there was no point in being bothered by what he couldn't change. Maybe it's just that I didn't see it coming. As fucked as the company is, I still thought they'd play us fair. And if I'd been paying attention, maybe I could have done something. Worthless thinking. It was already done. Jess sighed and glanced at his watch. He'd been out for 5.5 hours. Enough to be semi-sane for a while. He felt tired and low, but better than when he'd sacked out. At least now, he'd be able to think straight. And is that a good idea? Maybe you should just go back to sleep. Because if you think about what happened... There it was. That deeply uncomfortable feeling that he'd avoided as long as he could. He knew what it was. Anger. The kind that overwhelmed intelligence, that blocked out reason. Hatred, with no outlet, no place to go but deeper inside. Those men had died because some company suit had wanted a download from one of the ships docked at 949, the ship that had brought the bugs inside, and the blind fury burning inside of him would stay until he died, or until the company had paid for what it had done. The former was a hell of a lot more likely, and that only fueled the red and melting heat of his frustrated rage. And that scares the shit out of you, doesn't it? His mind whispered. Dying angry. Yes, he'd grown up angry, and that undirected rage was what had made him a volunteer in the first place. It had led him to murder a couple of lowlifes in a fit of passionate rage. It had led him to prison. He'd never been one to wallow in his past, coming to uneasy terms with what he'd done after a lot of introspection and a shitload of sight vids, but the emotion that had put him there. What was so troubling was that he felt he'd conquered it, that he'd learned how to ease himself out of his violent emotions. He could be angry without letting it rule him. Yeah, right, no problem. Thinking about what had happened to his team, that serenity he'd worked so hard to attain access to, was gone. It was a feeling both familiar and terrible, a feeling that he had no control over his emotions. He was afraid of dying without any sense of calm, that hopeless fury bright and seething in his heart. The company. The goddamn company. Jess heard Lara and Ellis in the front talking softly, and decided that he'd stay where he was, just a moment or two longer. He might not be able to come to terms with the great injustice that had been done to them before their time ran out, but he needed to try. He needed to at least navigate a path through the twisting bonds of his fury, whether or not he could walk it. It was funny. Even a year ago, he would have laughed himself silly over the idea that he'd spend his last hours trying to better himself. He'd gone from being a gun-running banger with little or no self-awareness to a con, to an HK volunteer, and somewhere along the way, he'd figured out what being a man, what being a human was really about. Jess shook his head, wondering where his sense of humour had gone. Fuck it. He was going to die, and hating the company felt good because it deserved to be hated. That brought a smile to his lips. Sometimes simple was best. After a time, he drifted back into a light, dreamless doze, thoughts of revenge keeping him warm as the shuttle spun through the endless black. As they got closer to the egg chamber, the stink of mouldy flesh grew, a smell like sickness and rot and the desperation of a slaughterhouse. Noguchi heard the soft hissing of hidden drones, but the only movement in the shadowy blighted structure was their own. Attack inside of a nest was highly unlikely. In spite of their size, the hunters moved with hardly a sound, only a whisper of padded armour brushing against itself and the occasional soft splash of a clawed foot in pooled and fetid water, those noises from the unblooded. Xenophobic and violent, maybe, but an experienced hunter had no equal in grace or stealth when he put his mind to it. There were no female Yautja hunters that she knew of, although the males did speak of their counterparts respectfully. In truth, she simply didn't know very much about the intricacies of their culture, even after a year. She'd grown tired of asking after being openly ignored for so long. Her mind was wandering. A defense against the smells and heat, against the memory of what had happened on Ryushi. The alien queen accepted almost any large animal to act as an incubator for her young, On Ryushi, it had been Rinth at first, the hatched facehuggers implanting the slow-moving cattle-like animals, the Queen forming a makeshift nest on the transport ship Lecter. Of course, humans had been next, and she'd met the leader Deshande in the subsequent nightmare. He'd brought his students to the seeded planet, unaware of the human colony, and the unblooded males had decided to hunt Uman after Broken Tusk had been wounded. There were strict rules against hunting intelligent species, she knew, but she also knew that there were many Yautja who wanted those laws repealed. Broken Tusk's students had proved that clearly enough. Together, she and the injured leader had taken out the Queen and saved most of the colonists, Broken Tusk slaying several of his students for what they had done. His dying act had been to engrave his jagged symbol between her eyes, the sign that she was worthy of Hunt. And you're still trying to distract yourself, to keep your mind busy, because you know what's coming. Topknot had already led the majority of the hunters around a curve ahead, the dark matter secreted by the drones forming extremely hard and somehow light absorbent walls. All of the hive as sleek and organic in appearance as she'd imagined melted rock would be. From the now nearly overpowering reek, she knew that they had reached the egg chamber. And while Noguchi was impatient to meet the Queen, she wasn't looking forward to this. Holding her burner at the ready, Noguchi stepped into the hot and shadowy, stinking layer, absorbing the environment as Topknot directed several of the students to unload their equipment. According to Hunter lore, the bugs had evolved on many worlds simultaneously. It saved them from having to take responsibility for spreading the breed so that they might hunt. And although she had worked not to concern herself with philosophies that she had no hope of changing, the result of the Yautja seeding was what was in front of them now. The incubators were different, but in almost every other respect, it was just like the Lecter. The ruptured bodies strung to the walls of the Lecter had primarily been those of Rinth. The creatures here were vaguely humanoid, 4 long, fleshy pink limbs, heads with 2 eyes, hands with digits. The slack, open mouths were filled with pointed teeth, open perhaps in expressions of pain and terror. The large empty shells in front of them, their fleshy petals peeled open, and the holes in their strange pink chest, burst out from inside, told the rest of the familiar story in simple strokes. Noguchi could see over a dozen of the life forms from where she stood, hanging randomly from the walls like dead ornaments, and the chamber stretched off into the shadows, too deep for her to imagine how many more had been implanted. What little light there was came from small, uneven holes in the ceiling above, filtering down in sickly streaks. At least these are dead, and they're not suffering anymore. A useless rationalization. Wherever the bugs went, the habitat was destroyed, certainly wiping out entire species. All kinds of indigenous life would suffer for untold generations. And on a more immediate level, Noguchi could hear rasping, mewling sounds coming from somewhere across the vast space, soft and droning. The noises were not bug. She could only hope that the living incubators were deeply asleep, perhaps dreaming of life, spared the horror of their fates until the very end. Topknot signalled and spoke, telling the Chosen 8 to ready themselves. They hefted their coils of rope, a heavy, braided, leather-like material that was stronger than anything humans had. Topknot's briefing aboard the ship had been fairly straightforward. The capture team would rope the Queen and hold her down, while the leader cut her from her egg sac. The other 4 hunters, herself included, would perform the basically unnecessary task of watching for drone attack. The leader moved easily into the dark, veering left, the others falling into position behind him. Noguchi covered the right rear flank, her frustration eased only a little by the sight of Shorty, covering right front. It was nice that the spotlight wasn't on her for a change. As senior hunters on the ship, Topknot, Scar, and 3-Spot were used to her, as were the regular crew. Mostly blooded Yautja too old to fight anymore. However they felt about it, they didn't study her every move on Hunt. But with each new training group, Noguchi was made painfully aware of how unprecedented her presence was. They watched her as she might once have watched some animal performing tricks. By fucking up, Shortly had taken some scrutiny off of her, His peers would be watching to see if he was competent. The unblooded all was eager to improve their caste. A low hiss from the blackness in front of them. Topknot stopped and raised his claw, the ropers spreading out. Noguchi's heart was hammering, and she was barely aware of the sudden smile on her face as she sidled farther right. And with a thundering, piercing scream, the queen lunged forward from the dark, her multiple talons reaching out to rip and tear, her grinning, wet jaws snapping for blood. The Yautja fell back, leaping quickly out of reach. As expected, the queen was unwilling to jeopardize her unborn children by abandoning her egg sac, a long diaphanous tube filled with her developing brood. She hissed and shrieked at the hunters from atop her gelid throne, slick drool sliding from her incisors, her inner jaws lowering into a strike position. Noguchi gazed up at her in awe, struck by her incredible design, by the mammoth shining comb that swept back from her eyeless, phallic skull. Her forearms snatched and clawed, her entire body trembling with rage. Twice as big as a drone, 1,000 times as deadly, because she could think. "Daturi!" Scar growled, and Noguchi shook herself at the sound of her hunter name, forcing her attention away from the feral queen. She stared off into the empty dark, holding her burner ready, reminding her that there would be time later. Now she had to fulfill her assigned task, no matter how pointless. The queen screamed as the hunters went to work, her seething fury echoing through the stinking dark. And somehow the sound made Noguchi feel much better about how her life was turning out.